welcome on behalf of GMF to this inaugural Alexander Philon Lecture. We are honored today to feature Nicholas Burns on GMF's virtual stage. Ambassador Burns is one of America's leading diplomats, now at Harvard's Kennedy School. He has had a brilliant diplomatic career to date, including stints as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador to NATO, and Ambassador to Greece. Ambassador Burns is one of those rare individuals who truly needs no introduction. His diplomatic skills are as well honed, and his fan club is as large as those of the man we are honoring today, Ambassador Alexander Philon. Ambassador Burns will offer keynote remarks, which will be followed by a moderated conversation. He is the perfect person to address our theme today, a new era for an old friendship, America and Greece in the 21st century. I and my many colleagues at GMF could not be more pleased to welcome all of you today in the context of an extraordinarily generous gift from Fokion Potamianos in honor of his father, Ambassador Filon, one of Greece's most distinguished diplomats and a former ambassador to the United States. We have been so pleased to have Ambassador Filon with us on many occasions at GMF, and we are delighted to have an exciting new avenue for our partnership. The Alexander Philon Fund for Transatlantic Partnership will support two important facets of GMF's work: our Marshall Memorial Fellowship Program and our Mediterranean Policy Program. Today's event is being held in the context of 4 virtual sessions this week, the 21st edition of GMF's Mediterranean Strategy Group series. Our thanks to all of our partners for helping to make this edition possible, including the U.S. Embassy in Greece. In that context, it is a special pleasure to have Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt with us today, as well as Ambassador Filon. Let me turn to them for their brief words of welcome. So first, let me give the floor to Ambassador Pyatt.
Great. Thank you, Karen. It's wonderful to be here. Let me say what a huge honor it is for me to be part of this inaugural Alexander Philon Lecture. Ambassador Filon has been a friend and an advisor to me and generations of my predecessors, not to mention his many contributions to the transatlantic relationship and U.S.-Greece relations from Washington. So I'm really delighted that we're able to do this all together. It's also a huge, huge honor for me to be speaking in conjunction with this presentation by Ambassador Nick Burns. Nick has been a mentor and a friend for many, many years. For my generation of the Foreign Service, he really is the personification of what it is to be an effective American diplomat. But I really didn't know how much I would owe to him until I arrived here in Greece. And I have to say, even after 5 years, I've stopped being surprised when I go into a new community or a village somewhere. And right after I introduce myself as the American ambassador, whoever I'm talking to immediately asks, "Do you know Ambassador Burns?" And it's of course an iron law of this profession that we all stand on the shoulders of our predecessors. But Nick continues to loom very, very large in the U.S.-Greece relationship. So I can't think of anybody better to address this topic today. And let me say thank you, Karen, to you and to Ian for the tremendous partnership that we have had with the German Marshall Fund in putting together this Mediterranean Strategy Group. Some of the ideas that we'll be focusing on over the next couple of days, Ian and I began chewing on 2 years ago in a session of the strategy group in Naples. And certainly in the 2 years since then, if anything, the importance, the relevance of the issues has grown, but also the contributions that Greece is able to make in the context of a really thriving US-Greece bilateral relationship, which I'm proud to say is arguably the best it has ever been in the modern history of our relations. And I have a clear mandate from President Biden and from the administration to raise it to an even higher level. And so it's a very exciting time to be American ambassador in Greece on all the issues we work together on. I think one of the things that really has helped to condition and shape the environment for this partnership is Greece's emergence from a very difficult decade of economic crisis, the confidence that that has inspired, but also Greece's return to the strategic stage as a military partner for the United States, playing a critically important role in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Balkans, but also as a diplomatic partner, working with Greece and Israel and Cyprus to pursue our shared interests with those democracies, working with Egypt, reaching into the Gulf and even now to India, which is another area where I know Ambassador Filon also has great experience. I should flag in the context of the discussions we'll have over the next couple of days, the critical importance of the China question as a global priority for the Biden-Harris administration. I think here in Greece, we're in a very good position to continue to work together on these issues. A government which believes passionately in the transatlantic relationship, but also has confidence in the United States. It is the Chinese themselves who called Greece and the port of Piraeus the dragon's head of the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe. But I think it's quite striking if I look back over the past year and a half or so in particular to see how smart Prime Minister Mitsotakis's government has been in its approach to China, whether that's on the question of critical infrastructure, and Greece has really been ahead of the curve in recognizing the importance, for instance, of the 5G decision, but also the way we work together. I remember when I arrived here 5 years ago, everybody was talking about the port of Piraeus. I think Senator Menendez raised it with me in our very first call before I came out here. The big game changer on that score, which I hope we can talk about a little bit over the next couple of days, is the Development Finance Corporation of the United States and the critical role that we have been able to carve out, creating a positive narrative around US investment in Greece and the way in which we've worked with the Greek government, especially to encourage US investors to look at critical sectors like infrastructure, critical infrastructure like ports and power grids. I should also note, and maybe finish up on this in setting the stage, obviously for all of us, the past 14, 15 months have been shaped significantly by the pandemic and the response to that. I would just share in particular with those who are not here in Greece, my enormous admiration for the way in which the Greek government has tackled this issue, the way in which we, the United States and Greece, have been able to work together. The special role played by Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, who is, of course, a very proud son of Thessaloniki, and Pfizer has been one of my key partners in working to lift the profile of American investment in Greece. But precisely because Prime Minister Mitsotakis and his government had a smart science-based approach to the pandemic, and because Greece and the government used the opportunity to accelerate moves in areas like digital transformation of the economy, Greece is positioned to emerge from this global crisis stronger than most. Prime Minister Mitsotakis is now faced with the challenge of how to allocate about 32 billion euros in European recovery funds for Greece. That'll have a critical role in shaping the Greek economy in the years ahead. And conveniently for me, for the United States, the Prime Minister's priorities line up perfectly with US priorities. A priority first on the green economy and sustainability, and second on things digital. And so we've got a tremendous partnership with the Prime Minister on that. And I think you're starting to see a return to some sense of confidence and optimism about where Greece is going. So I'm feeling very bullish about the bilateral relationship. It's been quite an experience to watch this over the past 5 years and to see the enormous progress that we've made on issues like our military and security cooperation, which is almost unrecognizable from what it was a few years ago. But I'm also confident that we haven't reached our limits yet and that there's much more that we can do in continuing to work with this government to build one of our strongest relationships in all of Europe. So again, thank you for the tremendous partnership with GMF, and I look forward very much to seeing some of the insights that emerge from the next few days of discussions on a critical set of issues.
Well, Ambassador Pyatt, thank you so much for joining us today for this inaugural kickoff, but also for your lifetime of diplomatic service, especially during your tenure in Greece. So thank you. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Filon.
Thank you, Dr. Donfried. And Ambassador Pyatt, thank you for what you've just said about relations between our two countries. It came as a total surprise to me. It took some time to register and to control my emotions when my son's wonderful gift, I learned about it, and there it was. But I was not surprised that he chose the German Marshall Fund as an organization, probably with the help of our dear friend, Robin West. Not surprised as well that the subject was the Transatlantic Partnership, with an emphasis on Greek-US relations and the strategic issues of the Mediterranean. My son, Fokion Potamianos, is a keen student of history, in particular of this area, from the Bronze Age to the digital age. In particular, his interest focuses on the role of Greece, of course, throughout history, but in particular, the last 2 centuries since Greece's independence. The war started in 1821, that's 2 centuries ago. My son also knows that Greek-American relations have been one of the main points of interest of my working life as a Greek diplomat for roughly 40 years. My life since childhood has been associated with the US, living in Washington, DC during the war. Then I found myself in New York City in the 60s, and then in Washington, DC as Deputy Chief of Mission in 1984 to 89, and then Ambassador 1998 to 2002. But there's another twist to this. Would you believe it, that in 1948, my father was in charge of the Marshall Plan in Greece. And I have seen a photograph of him at the signature between the US and the Greek government of this wonderful plan. So my life has been linked with most issues, as Ambassador Pyatt said. The issues that are going to be discussed in the next few days at the Mediterranean Strategy Group. Having served as Consul General in Istanbul and Ambassador in Ankara, you could imagine that relations with Turkey have always played a very important role for me. And I've always wanted them to be better than they are right now. My involvement with political issues with the European Union, as I was political director and then later Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I went into all the meetings and we discussed many issues that still are relevant today. And with NATO too, believe it or not, I didn't serve there, but I went to many meetings. And these issues, again with the Mediterranean, with bases, responsibilities, have not escaped my remit. And I feel that the Transatlantic Partnership that has been set up will have a positive and lively impact on the work of the Mediterranean Strategy Group, but I think the GMF in general. So I must thank you, Dr. Donfried, for your essential contribution in creation of this and program. And you may know that I have already attended many of the meetings, the Brussels meetings, the Mediterranean Strategy Group, and I know how much in depth these issues are discussed. China, of course, is going to be very much on our, and I think I'm looking forward to hearing from experts, because I don't think I know enough about the role of China, both in the north part of the Mediterranean, the south part of the Mediterranean. I'm sure that's all going to come up, and I think Ambassador Pyatt has mentioned this, and I want to thank him again. And of course, Ian Lesser, an old friend with whom I always went and discussed issues, but he also came to me sometimes about the issues of our relations. And he's a great expert, and he knows throughout these years, he has a tremendous knowledge. Then Nick Burns, a friend for many years, who kindly accepted to give the inaugural lecture. He in Athens and I in Washington, we worked very closely to promote the bilateral relations, and I think we succeeded in opening the way for the remarkable level that has been achieved, as Ambassador Pyatt has just said. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much for those words. We at GMF have been so lucky to benefit from your engagement and participation and brilliance over time, but just hearing you speak right now reminds me that one of the things that's so special about you is the power of your personality and the way it connects with your impressive diplomatic dexterity. And it's led to this lifetime of accomplishment. And I'm so excited that we will be celebrating that through this annual Alexander Philon Lecture, because it will remind us always of the values that you stand for and have represented throughout your career. It will remind us of the critical importance of diplomacy as we as individual countries, whether Greece and the US, pursue our interests, but also the shared interests that we want to pursue together. And it'll just remind us of who you are. So we are just thrilled to be kicking this off today. And I'm just delighted that you are part of this inaugural launch. And I know you are as excited as I am that Ambassador Burns is the one delivering this inaugural lecture.
Thank you.
With that, I will pass the baton to my wonderful colleague in Brussels, Ian Lesser, who is GMF's acting executive vice president. So Ian, over to you.
Karen, thank you very, very much. And, you know, listening to this, I want to add my own thanks to everyone, and I'll say some more at the end, but it also reminded me that not only do we have exactly the right people here for this conversation today, and above all, Ambassador Burns, but you also have a group of friends having a conversation. And that's exactly what we're going to do, in fact. And so just to give you all a roadmap to our plan for the rest of the event, we're going to have some thoughts from Ambassador Burns, Nick, if I may, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation among us, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you, and you'll be able to ask questions as well on this Q&A function that you'll find on Zoom, not the chat function, but the Q&A function, and I'll try to get to as many of those as I can before we come to our conclusion. But with that, again, Ambassador Burns, Nick, thank you very much for being with us. And let me give the floor to you to start us off.
Well, Ian, thank you very much for that introduction and the welcome. And I want to thank my friend, you, Ian, my friend, and also my other friend, Karen Donfried, for your leadership of the German Marshall Fund, for the inauguration of this program, and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm really delighted to be here, and good morning to everybody in North America. Good afternoon to all of our friends in Europe and especially in the Hellenic Republic in Greece in this very important bicentennial year where the Greek people can celebrate the extraordinary history of the Greek Revolution, of overcoming tyranny and empire, and reawakening the magic of Greece, of course, from the ancient world. I want to pay particular tribute to my friend, Ambassador Geoff Pyatt. We were just talking before this program began. Geoff is the longest serving American ambassador in Greece since Ambassador Lincoln McVeigh, who is FDR's ambassador to Greece and a Groton classmate of FDR from 1933 to 41, and then again from 43 to 45, when Greece was liberated itself and was liberated from Nazi tyranny. Geoff Pyatt, I would say in the long line of ambassadors since Ambassador McVeigh, we've had no one more effective and more successful than Ambassador Geoff Pyatt. To see his extraordinary focus and energy, to see the fact that he's been able to help the two governments become much closer politically, in trade and investment, in military terms. He bikes everywhere in Greece. He's on Twitter. I follow him on Twitter. I encourage all of you to do that. I think he's just had a remarkably successful ambassadorship. He deserves a lot of praise and a lot of credit. But Ian and Karen, it's a special honor for me to be with you today to pay tribute to someone who is a legendary Greek diplomat and someone whom I'm very proud to call a friend, Ambassador Alexander Philon. And thank you to the German Marshall Fund for having set up this lecture series in honor of Ambassador Filon. He is legendary as an ambassador of the Hellenic Republic. He had a remarkable 4-decade career. He rose to the very top ranks of Greek diplomacy as Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as ambassador to the United States, as ambassador to Turkey. I was thinking about him this morning. How would I describe him? I would describe him as a diplomat's diplomat. He's someone with almost unrivaled knowledge of the history and geography and politics, not just of his own country or of our country, to which he was ambassador, but of Europe and of the world. He's someone with a very sophisticated and urbane demeanor. He's a listener. And that's a very important quality in a diplomat. Alekos, when he was ambassador to the United States, and we were ambassadors to each other's countries simultaneously, Alekos, his job was to report back to Greece on the United States and on its politics and on its relationship with its country, and to help the Greek government translate itself back to the United States. That requires a man of discernment, a person who's a listener, a person who is a bridge builder, and he's also a man of peace. I've always admired him and respected him, and now I get to pay tribute to him today on behalf of the German Marshall Fund. And I think it's a really fine initiative that you've undertaken to place the fellowship inside the larger work that the GMF is doing on the Eastern Mediterranean itself, a region of increasing importance to the United States and to the world. So congratulations, Alekos, Ambassador Filon, for this great honor. And congratulations to your son and to all the others who put this fellowship together. This is a day that we want to celebrate Ambassador Filon and his legacy in the US-Greece relationship. It's also a day to celebrate the revival and the success of the United States relationship with Greece itself. There's no question we've seen a sea change and a positive change in relations between Athens and Washington, between our two countries and peoples, just in the last decade. And I do believe we now have the best, the sturdiest, the deepest, the broadest, the most successful relationship of any time since the immediate decade following the Second World War. Ambassador Pyatt has alluded to some of it. On the economic side, a diversification of our trade and investment relationships and a deepening that we hadn't seen in many, many decades. On the military side, we now see Greece, in my view, sitting outside the government, as our most important military partner in the Eastern Mediterranean. If we had met 10 to 20 to 30 or 40 years ago, I think most Americans would have said that is Turkey. No longer, given all the troubles that the United States has with Turkey and its autocratic leader, we now have rebuilt this relationship of trust and effectiveness strategically with Greece, not only in the Eastern Aegean Sea, but in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea beyond it. And again, that's a tribute. There's a tribute to many people on our side, certainly to President Obama, who took a bet on Greece and defended Greece and encouraged the European Union to defend Greece and to be accepting of it during the Greek debt crisis. It's a tribute to President Trump, who continued this very positive relationship with the Greek state and the Greek government and the focus on Greece. And it's certainly a tribute to President Joe Biden, who I think is going to deepen this relationship even further. The relationship is firing on all cylinders. And there's someone else responsible for this, someone I've known since he was a student at Harvard College when I was at the White House working on Greece relations for President George H.W. Bush. And that's the Prime Minister of Greece, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I think he has done a spectacular job at recentering Greece in a position of greater prominence inside the European Union and inside NATO itself. And he is certainly, with both President Trump and now President Biden, cemented a relationship of trust that frankly was not always there in the past between the Greek Prime Minister and the American president. So you have on the American side, Republicans and Democrats, who you may have heard sometimes spar with each other in Washington on domestic issues, entirely agreeing on the revival of this relationship and the importance of this relationship to the United States. And you have on the Greek side, I think, and I hope as I observe things from afar in contact with Greek friends, a new way of looking at the United States and a new trust in the United States. It was not always thus. And with Ambassador, in a day to honor Ambassador Filon, he, above all people, will understand we've sometimes had a complicated history in this relationship that has held us back. It's been a unique history over the past 2 centuries. If you think about the American and Greek revolutions, ours in the late 18th century, the Greek Revolution in the first quarter of the 19th century, both the American and Greek peoples overthrew mighty empires that were seemingly unassailable. Those empires had subjugated, sometimes in very cruel ways, the Greek and American peoples. And both empires were overthrown because both the American patriots and revolutionaries and the Greek revolutionaries recalled the ancient ideals that had been born, of course, in Athens and in Greece itself, in the ancient world. Ideals about freedom, ideals about self-rule, ideals about the importance of the effectiveness of government. And so in this bicentennial year, it's been so good to see so many Americans salute the accomplishments of the Greek Revolution. We might see them as twin revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries, leading towards the eventual, a century later, abolition of most empires in the world in favor of democratic governments. We were off to a very good start in this relationship. And in the 20th century, this relationship grew even deeper, particularly during our alliance against Nazi Germany, American sympathy for and support for the really valiant efforts of the Greek people to resist Nazi rule and Nazi tyranny, the efforts of the Greek Orthodox Church, the efforts of people like George Psikondakis, a young 18, 19-year-old during the Nazi occupation of his native Crete, who was a runner for the Greek opposition in the hills above the Nazi forces themselves. And if you haven't read his book, Cretan Runner, about the valor of these young Greeks who stood up really with no weapons on their side, but their hearts and their souls and their belief in Greece to oppose the Nazis, that's a book worth reading. The high water mark of this relationship, Ian, I think we also have to talk about the fact that the Marshall Plan in many ways centered on Greece and had perhaps its most profound impact in helping the Greek people to get back on their feet after the cruel occupation of their country by the Nazis. the insight that President Truman had in 1947 and 48 with the Truman Doctrine to avow that the United States would not allow the democratic countries to become communist countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain. These were great days in the relationship between the United States and Greece, but they were complicated days as well. And certainly, I think the lowest point in our relationship from an American perspective, and the one that we've all had to reflect on with a great deal of humility in hindsight, was the fact that when democracy was extinguished in Greece between 1967 and 1974, the United States, the Johnson administration and Nixon administration made the great historic mistake of supporting the Greek colonels and the Greek junta. We've had to atone for that. We've had to face that history. When I was sworn in as ambassador to Greece in 1997 by our Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, with her knowledge and her support, I said that I regretted, on behalf of our government, the fact that we had supported a dictatorship in the birthplace of democracy. Much more importantly, when President Bill Clinton visited Greece when I was ambassador in 1999, and Alekos and I were together on that during that visit to Athens, President Clinton said, as President of the United States, that the United States should not have supported the Greek military dictatorship. That history became a bitter history that for a while in the relationship was a true impediment to forward movement. If you think about all the students protesting against the United States in the years after the Greek military dictatorship, during my time as ambassador, a lot of acrimony on both sides of this relationship over our very complicated history. Many Greeks on the far left who perhaps had parents who were part of the Greek left, the losing side of the Greek Civil War, resented the presence of the United States, of the American embassy, of the American military in Greece. During the Kosovo War, a great deal of resentment in the Greek public about the fact that the United States had taken on another Orthodox country, in this case, Serbia, with good reason, we felt then and now, because Serbia had tried to ethnically cleanse Kosovo itself, had tried to drive 1 million Kosovar Muslim Albanians out of the country, and we, the United States and NATO, stopped that from happening. That was the right intervention by NATO and by the United States, but that wasn't convincing to many on the Greek side. I remember as ambassador, we had 63 demonstrations. We counted them over a 4 or 5 month period, some quite violent, in front of the American embassy in the spring and summer of 1999. This is part of the complicated history of this relationship. You look back in that time and the symbols of this entire history were up for grabs. The Communist Party attacked the Truman statue on Basileia Sophias in Athens, sawed it off and discarded it. The Communist Party attacked the statue of General Van Fleet in Kastoria in northern Greece. Van Fleet had been one of the primary partners of the Greek government in saving Greek democracy during the Greek Civil War. They threw that statue into Lake Kastoria. In both instances, I went to the government of Greece and said, of course, you'll help us put back up the statue of Harry Truman in Athens, the statue of Van Fleet in Kastoria. We didn't get much help from the PASOK government at the time, but we did get help from the mayor of Athens in Dimitris Avramopoulos, and the Truman statue was restored. We finally were able to dredge the lake in Kastoria and found the statue of Van Fleet and put that back up. There was a statue to the American Philhellenes who had come to Greece during the 1820s to fight with the Greeks and support them against the Ottoman Turks. That statue was covered with vines and soot from Athens traffic, and Mayor Avramopoulos restored it and now sits in a park opposite the home of Geoff Pyatt, the American ambassador to Greece. And we created a statue with the help of a HEPA, the great Greek American fraternal organization, a Greek sculptor, made a beautiful statue of General Marshall, a great friend of Greece, and that statue stands in the garden of the American embassy in Athens, facing the Greek people today. Why do I recount this ancient history of the battle of the statues over Truman and Van Fleet and the American Philhellenes and General and Secretary of State George Marshall? Because it's part of our history, a history that was contested largely by the Greek left, contested by people like me, who felt that on behalf of the American people and the American government, we had to stand up for our history and defend our history. A time of deep unrest when 17 November attacked Americans, murdered 5 members of the American embassy staff between 1975 and 1991, murdered a British brigadier, Colonel Sanders, at a time when I was in Greece during the late 1990s. These were bitter days. I mention them because we can't ignore our history, but we can learn from history. It was important for Americans like President Clinton to atone for the mistake of supporting the Greek dictatorship. Very important, I hope, and I trust, for Greeks to remember that America has been, with the exception of that period of the Greek colonels, a faithful friend, a true friend to Greece. And it's part of what I really value in seeing the revival of this relationship. I think those bitter days, the battle of the statues, the demonstrations, the violence, the acrimony, I think those days are behind us. They're truly behind us. Greece has become a strategic partner of the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean of great value. And the United States has become a partner to Greece that can champion what Greece needs for its own security, in making sure that the United States and NATO are paying attention to Turkish violations of Greek airspace and Greek waters in the Eastern Aegean Sea, to making sure that Greece and Cyprus, with another country called Israel, have the right to prospect for natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean at a time when both Russia and Turkey have become very difficult in the Eastern Mediterranean, when China sees a place for itself in the politics and future of the Eastern Mediterranean. There is no question that Greece is the anchor for NATO and the European Union and for the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that Greece itself is a country with and a government with greater self-confidence, with greater strategic vision in how to support the interests of the Greek people than I've seen at any time in my government career. So Ian and Karen, and especially to Alekos, who has played such a major part as a positive influence in the relationship between Greece and the United States, I'm very optimistic for the future of this relationship. And I commend the German Marshall Fund for having the foresight to focus more on the Eastern Mediterranean. I think our two governments are working together, as I said, in a way they haven't been for many, many decades. I think there's a sophistication and effectiveness on the part of the Greek government now about its responsibilities, not only in the Balkans and in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in the Middle East and North Africa. We're seeing a much larger Greek role in that respect. And in many ways, the secret weapon of this relationship are the people, and especially in this case, the Greek American community of 2.5 to 3 million Americans who trace their ancestry to Greece. They're an incredible force for good. They build thousands of bridges across the Atlantic between our two countries. They're bridges of history, of fraternal relations, of family, of region, and of business that I think are the most important part of this relationship when all is said and done. So thank you to the German Marshall Fund for giving me this opportunity to say these words on behalf of how I see the relationship, its past, its present, and its future. And Ian, I look forward to a good discussion with you and with all the guests today about how we can build an even stronger relationship in the future. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you very much for that. And, you know, in the remarks we've heard already, and above all in yours, I mean, you've woven together in a really wonderful way the history, but also, you know, the humanity of this relationship. And it reminds us that it's not just about strategy and policy, it's also about affinity and things of that kind. And the connection with our own DNA at GMF through the Marshall Plan is really remarkable as well. And so thank you for that. While people are sort of getting questions together and putting them in the Q&A, and we have quite a number already, I wanted to maybe come back to build on something that, well, several things that you said. I think we'd all agree that the US-Greek relationship at the moment is at a real high point. That's in part, I think, due to the skill of those who manage the relationship, but there's obviously bigger things going on. And you alluded to some of them. And I was going to ask you, Nick, to what extent do you also see this as, in a way, part and parcel of Greece, in a sense, being really now in the policy mainstream of the West, in the EU, in NATO? It's not just the change in the bilateral relationship, it's come in train with a whole set of other changes in Greek policy and strategy that have in some ways, I suppose, made it easier, but I throw that back to you. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with it, Ian. I think from, obviously the United States is just an observer of how the EU conducts its business, but, we know from recent history, and we know from some very good work by Greek journalists in writing about the Greek debt crisis between 2010 and 2015, that some in the EU came very close in those years to seeking maybe to jettison the Greeks and see the Greeks go their own way and leave the EU. And I think it was that near-death experience of Greece facing possible expulsion that concentrated the minds of a lot of Europeans on just how important Greece is. And I do want to credit, I think President Obama deserves a lot of credit. He stood by the Greeks. And as I understand it, his relationship with Chancellor Merkel counseled the European Union to make sure that with austerity came some hope and came support for the Greek people at their lowest point. I remember visiting Athens during the crisis and to see the pain in Greek families, in the Greek economy, and the businesses shuttered in Athens and Thessaloniki. The Greeks needed help, and it wasn't always clear they were going to get the right kind of help, at least the right mixture of help from the European Union. And I do think in that case, President Obama played a central role. And the way that he worked with the former government of Greece, the Syriza-led government, I think also was important. And for Europeans now, what a stroke of good fortune that Greece is in the European Union. The European Union needs a stable, successful Greece in the Balkans as a representative to the other Balkan countries that are not yet in either the EU or NATO of what a successful state looks like, what a responsible government looks like. To see Greece's influence now in the Eastern Mediterranean, as I said, I'm very, very respectful of what Ambassador Pyatt has done. He's built up with the Greek military and Greek government our strategic military relationship centered on Suda Bay, centered on Crete, because right now we do not have an ally we can count on in Turkey, but we do have an ally we can count on in Greece. So for both NATO and the EU, Ian, I think it's very important to see the newfound importance and the eastern edge of both of them, southeastern edge of a stable, prosperous, effective Greek government.
Nick, on the Eastern Mediterranean itself, you alluded to Turkey, you spoke directly about it. In fact, there's no question that this is in a sense, an accident waiting to happen. There is a risk of brinkmanship here. It's cooler now than it was perhaps some months ago, but the potential is there again. The Turkish energy minister yesterday said that they had every intention of going back into the Eastern Mediterranean to conduct exploration and drilling operations. The potential for greater risk again is there. What can we do in that risk reduction mode with all the problems with Turkey, with all the difficulties in the relationship? Arguably, there's probably no country with a greater stake in sort of Turkey's long-term integration with the West and stability than Greece. But we're also a stakeholder in this as Americans. What can we do?
I think we have to play for time. Maybe Ambassador Pyatt wants to come back in if he wishes, and because he would be a much more authoritative spokesperson than I can be. I'm out of government, simply observing from my university perch. But certainly, we will want both Greece and the United States both NATO and the EU, want to have and need to have positive relationships with the Turkish government. And there's no question, given Turkey's size, given its history, given its geographical place as a uniter of two continents, that Turkey will remain centrally important. But right now, it's difficult to count on the Turkish government because of the authoritarian nature of that government, because of its, I think, needlessly provocative statements and actions towards Greece, towards Israel, towards Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus itself. I think what we need to do is play for time, try to diminish the risk of an accidental conflict, obviously, try to minimize some of the controversy from some of the statements made by the Greek president, the Turkish president, excuse me, and others. And the United States and NATO need to play the role that they've always played as an effective buffer and intermediary in some of the disputes between Turkey and Greece. I think all of us have to be concerned about Greek actions, the Turkish actions, excuse me, that question in an irresponsible way the sovereignty of Greece in some of the islands of the Eastern Aegean Sea and where that maritime and maritime border is. And we have to encourage the Turks to be constructive and to cease actions that would be needlessly provocative. The same goes for the Eastern Mediterranean and some of the challenges that the Turks have made, I think, needlessly and wrongly to what the Cypriots and the Israelis and the Greeks are doing in the way of natural gas exploration. So can the United States be that buffer? I hope so. Can NATO be that buffer as well? I hope so as well. And we all have to hope that democracy will return to Turkey and that Turkey will return to the center of NATO as it was for so many years, but clearly is not there now.
Ian, I'm happy to jump in for a second.
By all means, I was about to invite you. Go ahead, please, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Ian. So I would just add 2 points from an Athens perspective. One, I think especially for colleagues in Washington and elsewhere, is just to appreciate how severe the crisis of last summer was. I think many folks, even those who follow this part of the world closely, do not appreciate how close to a real calamity the two countries came because of some of the provocative actions that Turkey was engaged in with its maritime exploration. Certainly the most severe tensions between the two NATO allies since the EMEA crisis of 1996. Fortunately, we're in a very different situation today. And I would highlight 2 aspects. One is, and this is a topic I've discussed at great length with the defense minister and senior Greek military leaders, nobody wants a return to the acute tensions of last summer. And at Prime Minister Mitsotakis' level, there is a strong commitment to diplomacy. Foreign Minister Dendias has been very clear about this as well, seeking to identify a strategy to try to work towards some longer-term resolution of the underlying maritime disputes that gave rise to the crisis of last summer and those previously. I think Greece also has come to these issues with a strong belief, as you said, Ian, that they have a powerful interest in Turkey remaining anchored in the West and anchored in Euro-Atlantic institutions. And also that there is much to be gained from shifting the relationship away from undersea energy resources that are likely never to be exploited and back onto areas of mutual benefit. The Greek side, the lead negotiator on these issues, Ambassador Apostolidis, is a deeply informed legal and diplomatic expert. He has been involved in several rounds of negotiations with his counterpart. Press has confirmed now the invitation that Foreign Minister Dendias has extended to Foreign Minister Savasulu to come to Greece towards the end of this month for another round of ministerial level discussions. So I think we're in a better place, but this is also an issue that I think after Karen's confirmation will be very much part of her work requirements in terms of continuing to engage on these issues and bring American diplomatic leadership to bear, which is really critically important. because unlike the European Union, we can be more of an effective independent actor on these issues, even as we work with our European allies.
Jeff, thank you very much for that. And thanks for coming in. Nick, I wanted to maybe go back to remarks that have been made about the role of NATO. I mean, there is an issue about the role of NATO in terms of risk reduction, but there's also an issue about the role of NATO strategically, more broadly in the Mediterranean. And NATO is about to embark on a revision of its strategic concept. There's always been something of a, if I can say, a second class character to the debate over strategy looking south for very understandable reasons for most of NATO's history. Are we at a moment where that is about to change, do you think? Or is there a sort of accumulation of challenges in the south, as difficult as they are? Has it come to a point where NATO has to have a more explicit strategy towards the Mediterranean?
Well, I think it'd be well advised for the alliance to think strategically in depth about the Eastern Mediterranean. You know, it's obvious during most of the Cold War, the focus of NATO had to be on the North German plain, on the Fulda Gap, on the huge concentration of armed forces between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the focus was expansion. NATO expansion into those formerly communist states and the liberation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania from the Soviet Union itself in late 1991. That was the focus then. I think in our time now, with the security of the members of NATO on the eastern flank very, very much in place, what is now up for grabs, or what is now perhaps what needs strengthening? I think it's NATO's southern flank. It's certainly the Black Sea area, and there's been a lot of attention given to that because of our support for Ukraine and for some of the other littoral states of the Black Sea. And it's definitely the Eastern Mediterranean, because you do see, I think, in my own personal view, unhelpful actions by the Russian government, and sometimes unhelpful actions by the Chinese government as well. And so I do think NATO, in its next strategic concept, and it's overdue for one, will be well advised to think in a deeper sense about the strategic importance of the Eastern Med.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much. And I wanted to start to move to some of the questions that have come in, because there are actually quite a lot of them. And maybe if I could go first, and I'm sort of grouping some of these together, but there's an interesting one from John Koenig, actually, who is asking about the trilateral diplomacy. I'm going to shorten this a little bit, John, with if you'll forgive me. A lot of attention to the trilateral diplomacy that's been happening recently in the Eastern Med, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt in this as well, encouraged by successive US administrations, in fact. If you could comment a bit on this in its energy dimension, but perhaps going beyond that as well.
Well, I first want to thank John Koenig for being with us. John was our political and military officer in Athens when I was ambassador, and also our consul general, a very successful consul general in Thessaloniki in northern Greece. Of course, went on to become ambassador to Cyprus and deputy chief of mission at NATO. So he has deep, deep experience in this. And I think John's right to take the discussion in this direction, because, you know, it gets to the fact that Greece plays many roles on behalf of the EU and of NATO. Greece is a leading country, I think the most successful country right now in the Balkan region. It's also a country that's central, obviously, to the Eastern Mediterranean, but also a country that is working productively with others in the wider Mediterranean region on behalf of stability in the Middle East, Egypt specifically. And if you think of Greece in concert with Italy, its fellow EU and NATO member, this is a powerful force for good in a region. If you think about North Africa, think about troubles in Libya, that's quite unstable. So I do think the fact that Greece, in a confident way, is now facing almost in all directions, north in the Balkans to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, but also south to its neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. It's very important that from a military, political, economic, business perspective, the Greek people are facing in all those directions.
I think there are a number of questions that have come in that are of a much more detailed economic and commercial character, which maybe gets us a little bit off of our sort of core concern here. But there are also things that are important, and you alluded to some of them. I mean, the ability to diversify the relationship, to have a stronger economic base, to work on manufacturing in a new and higher tech way. Maybe just a couple of thoughts about that and sort of how it plays into the geopolitics.
Well, obviously we're seeing the diversification of the Greek economy from what it had been for many, many decades, from the end of the Second World War until very recently. And perhaps, I mean, I'm just thinking aloud here, Ian, but I'd invite Ambassador Pyatt, who knows much more about this subject than I do, to intervene. Out of the crisis, the Greek debt crisis, I think had to come a lot of soul searching about how Greeks could make their way in the world. What was Greeks' comparative advantage? Obviously, tourism remains a fundamental part of the Greek economy, but I've always been impressed by the human talent. When you meet Greeks in Greece, and then you meet Greeks all over the world, whether it's in London or whether it's in I Athena tis Amerikis, the Athens of America, Boston, I Bostoni, whether it's in Melbourne, and my wife and I spent some time in Melbourne in 2019, amazed at the size and influence of the Greek community in Australia as well. The Greek people are entrepreneurial and they're forward looking. And as I've just, I follow Ambassador Pyatt and I follow our embassy and try to learn from them to see the diversification in the Greek economy, the human talent, Greeks on the front edge, the leading edge of the AI movement, of biotech, a Greek from Thessaloniki running arguably one of the most important companies in the world right now, Pfizer, which has saved us during the pandemic. I'd invite Ambassador Pyatt maybe to run with this theme and give a better answer to this question than I could.
Jeff, please, if you'd like.
Sure, I'm wondering, yeah, unmuted there. Start my video. Nick put his finger on it. I think two of the big stories of the post-crisis Greek economy are, one, the rise of these new sectors, and technology is a big part of it. The fact that Microsoft has invested more than $100 million in a cloud computing center here around Athens, which they've done not just to service the Greek market, but a wider region of 30 million people up through the Western Balkans. It goes to the way in which the Prespis Agreement, for all of the political controversy it caused at the time, has really helped to raise Greece's foreign policy ambition, but has also unlocked a vision that all of us who work on this part of the world have looked at for a very long time, and goes to this idea of how the United States and Greece work together to reinforce NATO's southeastern flank, but also to complete the work of European reform and European expansion in the former Yugoslavia, and all the way up to Ukraine, a country where I also spent a hugely important part of my career. So it's very exciting to see that unfolding. And what's really interesting to me also is not only is the Greek technology sector prospering, but how frequently I run into Greek Americans in this area, including some Greek Americans who have come back. So for instance, Nick alluded to Pfizer. The first project that I started working on with Albert Bourla long before the pandemic was Pfizer's technology center in Thessaloniki. Many of the young people that Pfizer has recruited for that operation are examples of brain gain. Greeks who were forced out of the country during the economic crisis years and have now come back. And then also the very important role for the Greek American diaspora. And one example, which I mentioned because it unifies many themes that are of interest to Nick, is a company called Advent Technologies, which I first stumbled on in Patras about 3 or 4 years ago. Their product line is focused on small hydrogen fuel cell power generation units, which seemed very esoteric 4 years ago and is now flavor of the month. Advent has expanded in Greece. It also has expanded its operations in Boston, which is where its corporate headquarters are. It's had its IPO on NASDAQ, and now it's acquired a company in California, in Livermore. So it's a great example of the synergies between our economies, and especially the way in which we're now seeing a very exciting phenomena of growth in this green energy sector that's going to be so important to the future of both of our countries. And both in terms of American investment here, but also Greek innovators investing in the United States in our own energy transformation, which is going to move very fast because of the decisions that President Biden and Secretary Granholm and the rest of the team have made.
Jeff, thanks very much. A lot of questions here. Another one that, and there are several sort of around this theme. This one's from Yanis Karas. Again, I'm going to shorten it a bit, but basically it's about Russia and how you would read Russia's role in the region, its return to the Eastern Mediterranean, if you think about Syria and Libya, but also in particular, how it plays into the bilateral relationship between the United States and Greece for the future.
You know, I'm happy to continue this tandem relationship here, where I say my opinion, then Ambassador Pyatt comes in with all the facts and current insights. I worked on Russia for a long time, including 5 years at the White House during the collapse of the Soviet Union, the early years of the Russian Federation, which were more hopeful times. I think probably with the exception of the US-China relationship, this is the most difficult relationship we have in the world. I think China is the most challenging, but Russia is awfully difficult right now as a competitor to the United States. The fact that Russia is still threatening Georgia and now especially Ukraine, covering up for the high crimes of the Belarusian government that we saw just over the weekend with this air piracy, this outrageous act by the Belarusian government being in effect supported by the Russian government this week. The massive cyber attacks on the United States instigated, if not by the Russian state itself, with the blessing of the Russian state by other actors, nefarious black actors, black market actors in Russia itself, to see what the Russians have done so cynically in using their air power to go after civilians in city after city throughout Syria, the massive loss of life at the hands of the Russian Air Force. We have to contain Russian power, in my view. In Europe, it's one of our most important global objectives. I think that in a Washington that often is separated in terms of the political parties not being able to work together, there's a unity of purpose, I think, on behalf of nearly every senior Republican leader in Washington, every senior Democratic leader, that we've got to be together in containing Russia and working with NATO and working with the European Union to do that from a human rights perspective, from a military perspective, and also in the wider world, as we see the Russians pushing out in the Eastern Med itself, its unhelpful influence in places like Syria and Libya, Russia working with China, contrary to all the interests of the United States in many parts of the world. So it's a major, major goal of the United States, and it's going to be a long-term one as long as people like Vladimir Putin are leading the Russian government.
Do you think this Russian activism in areas like the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean, is affecting Greece, affecting our interests? Is it sustainable?
Well, you know, I teach a course at Harvard called Great Powers, and I start, when we look at Russia, we look at Russia and China and India, Japan, the United States intensively, the EU. We look at Russia, I advise my students, don't underestimate this country. If from one perspective, if you look at their critical demographic state, their failing public health, the rate of alcoholism, the rate of worker absenteeism because of health-related problems, the fact that it hasn't reformed its economy, it's still a largely carbon-driven economy. Russia still has, to buttress it, the most experienced leader in the world today. Vladimir Putin has been in power longer than any other leader of a major country. To see the fact that he has been able to modernize the Russian nuclear weapons force, the Russian Navy, the Russian Air Force. He's given it a purpose. None of this is positive, by the way. It's all negative. but you have to understand that Putin has strengthened the Russian state. And he knows that he can't take on the United States directly and NATO directly because we're stronger. So he uses asymmetric means like cyber attacks to keep us off balance and to try to undercut us. And so he's a worthy foe, and he's someone that we have to be wary of. But I have no doubt, especially under President Biden's leadership, and President Biden has so much experience in this realm, that by strengthening the American role in NATO and strengthening the US-EU relationship, and both had suffered, frankly, in the last administration, I think President Biden is going to strengthen our ability to contain Russian power. But Ambassador Pyatt is going to have a better view. I really would like to hear his views on this issue.
Thanks, Nick. So just very quickly, I'll make 2 points. One, important to remember that in 2018, the Greek government, the Greek foreign ministry, expelled 4 Russian intelligence operatives. And it's interesting, if you look at the charges against those Russian individuals, it was both their efforts to undermine the Prespis Agreement by meddling in Greek domestic politics, but also of special sensitivity. They're meddling in the Greek Orthodox Church. And this is a source of sensitivity and concern to all of us. I know President Biden's personal relationship and respect for the ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul. And I think we hope very much that His All Holiness will be in Washington in the United States later this year. But I expect we are going to continue as a government to signal our support for this as a matter of religious freedom and self-determination, even as we have to walk the line created by our constitutional separation of church and state. But this is, I think, a central feature of the Russian malign influence toolkit in Greece today that we need to be attentive to. It's natural that Greece has a relationship with Russia. Foreign Minister Dendias was with Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday in Sochi, and today there's some really charming photographs of the Greek foreign minister meeting with the Greek diaspora in Pontus, in the Black Sea region, meeting communities of children who speak Greek, who are part of the Russian minority. And I know that the foreign minister is also looking forward to doing something similar in Ukraine before too long. So that's a natural aspect of the relationship. But the malign behavior is something in which we have a shared interest. I would also make the point that Jamie Fogo, Admiral Fogo, makes all the time, that when he was a young officer commanding in his first command in the Mediterranean, we did not have to worry about great power adversaries. When he finished up as the commander of Navier in Naples, we did. You have the closest Russian mercenary Wagner Air Force base to NSA Suda Bay is in Libya, where the Wagner Air Force has been operating. You have a Russian naval facility in Tartus. You have the Russian expansion of its naval footprint in illegally occupied Crimea, which Russia uses to project naval power through the Aegean and out into the Eastern Mediterranean. And there's no question that the Hellenic Navy and the Greek armed forces are essential naval partners in helping us to deal with that contingency and calculate our appropriate response.
Nick, there's a question here that actually follows on very directly from this subject, and it's from Henri Barkey, asking if you can comment on the expansion of the American bases in Crete and northern Greece. Do they represent an attempt at strengthening the deterrent against Russia? How would that work? Or is this an attempt at something else?
Well, Henri Barkey knows more about Turkey than I will ever know. He knows this part of the world well. You know, I'm respectful enough, Ian, the fact that I've been out of government for some time. I don't have the knowledge and responsibilities that Ambassador Pyatt has. I think it's a serious question that I would, if you don't mind, Jeff, I would like to punt to you.
It's very quick. This is all about enhancing NATO capabilities to deal with NATO's principal external challenge, which is the Russian armed forces. It's not linked to anything else. It's about enhancing the flexibility and the options available to U.S. forces. That's regarding our presence in Thrace and Alexandropoli. as well as central Greece, much of which has been focused on the enhancing of flexibility for deployment of U.S. power into the Western Balkans and Black Sea region. And NATO NSA Suda Bay, of course, is a unique asset used by 3 different geographic and component commands: EUCOM, AFRICOM, TRANSCOM, CENTCOM, all of whom believe that Suda is really an indispensable asset because of its physical location, but also because of the superb quality of the cooperation between our forces there. It's a Greek facility in which we are guests, but we're very, very grateful for the outstanding support that we receive every single day from our hosts in the Hellenic Armed Forces.
And Nick, maybe that's an opening for me to ask you something that, you know, was a concern for you when you were in Athens. We were doing a lot from Suda Bay even then, perhaps not the same things precisely, but we were doing a lot. But it was much more difficult politically to talk about it. You started to talk a little bit about why that's become more comfortable, but we've seen it become more comfortable, not just with this current Greek administration where it's obvious, but also with its predecessor, where it was, you know, less natural. What accounts for that, do you think?
Well, I think that the passage of time, the fact that both the American government and the Greek government are looking forward, are focused on our present responsibilities and what unites us. I do think that we were encumbered by our history. We were held back by our history, at least some of the mutual acrimonies. Greeks legitimately, when I was ambassador, were critical of the United States, as I said, for supporting the Greek colonels, the Greek dictatorship during that 7 years of the 60s and 70s. And Americans, I think many on our side felt that we didn't have the support we needed during the Kosovo War. And that was a difficult issue for many Greeks because of the Orthodox ties. So I think our history complicated relations for a time, but it's an older story. This is 2 decades ago. I think the history of the last 10 years especially have been almost uniformly positive. When Greeks saw, as I said before, Ian, and Jeff knows this very well, everything positive that President Obama did to support them, that President Trump did to support them. And for me, I think, Ian, given our complicated politics in Washington, the United States is strongest when we can unite at home on the basis of what we're trying to do. And in my view, there is a consensus in Washington that Greece is more strategically important to us now than it has been before because of the evolution of Greece itself. And that's very positive. I don't see history preventing the relationship from moving forward. And maybe there were days in 1999 when I certainly saw that that was the case when I was ambassador. So I think Jeff's ambassadorship has really been historic in that sense. It's been a fundamental turning point psychologically in the relationship on both sides.
Jeff, thanks. There's a question from Christine O'Krent, who is asking something, you know, actually getting close to our theme for the week in the Mediterranean Strategy Group, which is about China's expanding its economic and political influence. She's asking about the Balkans, but one could say the same, I think, about the Med more broadly. How could the US and the EU be more effective in containing it? And I guess that also begs the question of whether we should be containing it, but over to you on any of those.
Jeff, do you want to take a swing at that?
Sure. Well, I would just come back to what I said in my opening remarks. The most powerful thing we can do is to create a positive narrative. And I hope colleagues in Washington have a sense of what a game changer the Development Finance Corporation has been and how important it is for them to remain engaged in this part of the world. I had a very good relationship with the previous management. I'm very proud of the fact that the new management's first international phone call was actually with Minister of Economy Georgiadis here in Athens. That's helped considerably by congressional interest on these issues. I worked specifically with Senator Murphy and Senator Menendez to achieve congressional approval that we required to authorize the DFC to work in Greece, even though it's a developed economy and is not prima facie eligible for DFC financing. And that congressional support continues. And I think all of us who are interested in this part of the world, the Western Balkans and Greece, need to stay focused on that. And I would emphasize in particular A lot of the Chinese interest and Russian for that matter has been in these areas of heavy infrastructure and energy. And there are two things that have been a game changer. One is the Precipice Agreement, but the way that has unlocked new pipelines, new arrangements, relations between Greece and Bulgaria, as my Bulgarian counterpart likes to say, are better than they've been for 1,000 years, propelled by the IGB pipeline connecting Greece to Bulgaria and in turn connecting to the US-supported floating regasification unit in Alexandroupoli, which is designed to inject US and other LNG into the Greek pipeline network. That's all now extending into North Macedonia up to Kosovo. Serbia has contracted for offtake from the Alexandroupoli FSRU. So there's a whole new energy map that's being written in Southeastern Europe, propelled by the strategic vision that the United States through multiple administrations has supported. And a key aspect of this, of course, is, and Nick, you'll remember the Southern Gas Corridor is finally real, as opposed to just being a topic of DCs and PowerPoint presentations. All of that is changing the dynamic here. And because of the role that LNG will play as a bridge to sustainable energy, it's going to be very important also in helping Southeastern Europe to meet its Paris climate targets.
And Ian, I would add one thing to what Jeff has said, and I really congratulate Jeff and the US government and all the progress that's been made. I think there's a recognition in Washington that our competition with China in particular, but also with Russia, is not going to be a replay of the Cold War. That was a unique set of circumstances where the military confrontation was paramount. The competition in the next couple of decades was going to be focused on economic power and on technology, particularly the digital age technologies. If you think about both civilian and military aspects of artificial intelligence and machine learning, of quantum sciences and biotech, that's where the United States needs to succeed. And there's a recognition, I think, and I admire this about the strategic planning in President Obama's infrastructure program, that the way to strengthen us globally is to strengthen us at home, is to strengthen our science and technology capacity, is to get back to the federal government injecting R&D spending into our research institutions and universities and supporting our tech companies and unifying that innovation triangle that Walter Isaacson talks about that really made America the great technological power it is. That's where the competition is going to be keenest and most difficult. And I do think that President Biden is absolutely right about focusing attention there. And I guess I'd say one more thing quickly. A recognition in the statements of Secretary Blinken, of Jake Sullivan, of other leaders of the administration that, and certainly the president and vice president leading, we need to stabilize our own home front to be successful globally. And that gets to conquering the pandemic. And we've seen the enormous progress, and you feel it in the United States with a number of people being vaccinated. It gets to seeing an economic revival and a return to very strong GDP growth rate in 2021. It gets to accounting for race. And this week in the United States, there's been a lot of deserved attention given to what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the great massacre of the African-American community there a century ago. And of course, the year anniversary of the tragedy, the murder of George Floyd. I think by focusing on race, by concentrating the American public on racial justice, we're strengthening the country and stabilizing, as well as looking, I hope, which we will do, is look intensively at what produced January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol, and to tell the truth about it. I think there should be a bipartisan commission to do that. This focus on the home front and our economy and technology base, I think that's the core of what we have to do to compete with the authoritarian powers, whether it's Russia or China. It gives me a lot of hope that if these plans can go through for the president's infrastructure bill, we can really strengthen ourselves for the next decade or two, which we have to do in the face of this really considerable strategic competition from China, especially.
So Nick, there is a rather interesting and maybe slightly playful, but very important question, I think, that we've gotten, especially it's interesting for the whole group everyone who's with us today, in fact. It's from Diana Negroponte, who's asking, in an age of constant availability and sharing of information, what is the particular advantage that ambassadors bring to the task of maintaining diplomatic relations?
First of all, I want to congratulate Diana. For those people who have not read her masterful new biography of one of our most successful diplomats and secretaries of state, James A. Baker III, I urge them to read it. And Diana's a great historian, and she's written a really fine book. Maybe Jeff and I can say a word on behalf of ambassadors. I was an ambassador. Jeff is an ambassador, which is more important than my was. But, you know, look, there is nothing more important than the human contact and knowledge and understanding that comes from personal relationships. And so, yes, the job of an ambassador in every country of the world, Ambassador Filon could speak to this as well, has changed from what it was during the time when it took months or even years in medieval times from messages from the capital to reach the ambassador. So ambassadors pretty much could make up the job as they went along. Not in the age of instantaneous communications of the world we live in now, of a globalized networked world. But there is no substitute for having Jeff Pyatt in Athens to have a personal relationship of trust with the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis, to be steering, look at the answers Jeff has given us, our economic relationship, our technological base, the natural gas links, the buildup of Suda and our military relationship. That can't happen by remote control. It won't happen because there's no one senior enough who would be focusing on Greece 24 hours a day in Washington. Jeff's the point person for that. And so, of course, we need ambassadors in the world, and ambassadors who would understand the complexities of culture, of language, of history, in the way that sometimes is not felt if you're 3 to 10,000 miles away from the country. So I would say this is a time when, because of the complexity, because of the rivalries that we democratic countries have with authoritarian countries, you need human beings to keep the peace, to translate. An ambassador's job is twofold. It's to translate your government to that host government and translate that host government back to your home government. Human beings have to do that. And that's why we need ambassadors. But Jeff will have a better answer than that.
No, I'll just, a very, very quick additional thought. Something that I learned in a very powerful way, especially working in a big and hugely complex country, India, over many, many years, is how important this diffusion of power that technology is producing is to the way in which states and economies relate to each other in the global system. And so it's all the things that Nick said. It's the ability to listen carefully to your hosts, but it's also critically, in my experience, the ability to get in your car and get out of the Capitol and talk to people. And I think, especially because of the way technology has empowered individuals, and the way in which technology is making it possible for a small firm, another good Greece example, a small firm called Sunlight, with its headquarters in Eastern Macedonia and Thrace, to become a world leader in batteries, and suddenly to invest in a factory in South Carolina in order to supply the US marketplace and create jobs in the United States. That you can only do that kind of thing if you're able to free yourself from email and get out and, as Nick said, do the kind of retail diplomacy that I know he did exceptionally well here, because I still run into the wake that it has left at least once a month or so.
Jeff, thank you very much. And I know several of us have also mentioned, your extremely effective presence on Twitter, which also underscores the sort of transparency and public diplomacy side of this. And so, the technology question and the traditional diplomacy question aren't necessarily separable in that sense. I'm conscious of our time. I want to say just a few words in closing, but before I do that, Nick, I wanted to go back to you and just if there was any, final words from your side that you'd like to offer us, that would be wonderful.
Ian, my role here would be to thank you and thank Karen Donfried for GMF's commitment to the U.S.-Greece relationship and to the wider space of the Eastern Mediterranean first. Second, I think what runs through this event for me and what I take away from it and what I've learned from in listening to Geoff and to you and to Ambassador Filon is the importance of diplomacy. And for Americans, especially as a great global power, there's no question, especially after 9/11, that we prioritized our military and intelligence assets, and we had to, given the threat that we faced. There's also no question in my mind, we now need to rebuild American diplomacy, rebuild the State Department, support the US foreign and civil service with funding, with creativity, and to elevate the role of diplomacy in our foreign policy. I think that's going to be a requirement for us in the next couple of decades. And so the fact that GMF has established this lecture series in honor of a great diplomat, Ambassador Alexander Philon, I think is perfect symmetry and symbolism for what we need to do. And that is to think creatively about how we can represent the United States, its interests in the world effectively more through diplomacy as a first engagement than anything else. I'll leave you with a maxim that Colin Powell drummed into us when he was Secretary of State. And here's a man who spent 35 years in the United States Armed Forces. He said the proper way for a country to think about itself, its assets, is diplomats on point, military and intelligence in reserve. And perhaps by necessity, after 9/11, when we came out swinging and we had to put the military on point. I think the military is an incredibly important institution in our society, but most members of our military would say we need ambassadors like Jeff Pyatt on point, the military in reserve when the interests of the nation require the military to act. But most of our interactions in the world will be through American diplomats on a government-to-government basis. So that's my hope for the energy we're going to see in Washington and around the world, a revival of American diplomacy. So your establishment of the Alexander Philon Lecture Series I think, goes hand in glove with that. And it honors a great Greek diplomat whom we want to salute today for his legendary career.
Nick, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing these thoughts, which were, right on, as you say, the point, but on the point of the bilateral relationship, but actually went much beyond that, which is just so useful for us. And we're very grateful you were able to take the time to do this. Let me just conclude by adding my thanks to the Philon Fund for making this possible, but also for allowing us to have this wonderful celebration for Alexander, but also to have his counsel in what we do in this Mediterranean work going forward, which was so incredibly valuable to us, both as a matter of friendship, but also just as a matter of, well, counsel and experience and advice. So that's a real point of thanks for us. Alexander, thank you. It's great to see you. Great to have you with us. We look forward to having you with us in person when we start doing these meetings that way again. Geoff, thank you for being with us, but also thank you for weighing into the conversation in a very active way. We really, really appreciate that, and for all the support that the embassy has given us for our work. We're really most grateful. I also want to say a special word of thanks, if I could, to our GMF chairman, Robin West, who played really an integral role in making all of this happen. Robin, thank you so much. As always, to my colleagues, to Karen, and indeed to all of the colleagues who you don't see behind the scenes, like Alberto and John, who actually make this happen. My thanks to them. And above all, our thanks to all of you who've joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon at GMF, hopefully in person, but in the meantime, certainly virtually. So good afternoon to you all from Brussels. See you again soon. All the best.